And now, the Lowe Post.
Welcome to the Lowe Post podcast, where on a Thursday morning I am continuing my effort to live in the 1990s because 2020 just sucks too badly. And I am thrilled to have, I think for the third time, one of the absolute legends of this business, a Hall of Famer, one of the greats of all time, the author of several books, all of which you should have read by now, the one and only Jack McCallum. How are you, sir?
With that introduction, I guess I'm pretty good, Zach. Nice to be here, man.
It's great to see you, and I don't know if it's your most famous book. It probably is, The Dream Team, which was written 2012. Did The Dream Team come out?
Yes, 2012.
So the reason we are having this podcast, other than I really like talking to you, is very shortly you are going to premiere a podcast series called The Dream Team Tapes, in which you revisit the making of the Dream Team, everything Dream Team. All of this is relevant again because of The Last Dance and will always be relevant. And you unearthed all your recording tapes of all your interviews with the subjects. They're interspersed in. I've listened to the first 3 episodes. It's fantastic. When exactly does it launch?
I believe it launches a couple days. We're trying to figure out how close to do it to Jordan. Jordan has overtaken the world. And it was going to be the day after, I think May 18th. But at sometime during that week, there will be enough alert about it. That's for sure.
So I've listened to the first 3 episodes, and I'm not going to lie. When I first heard about the idea, I thought, well, it'll be good because all the characters are these are icons. All of them are icons. But I thought, this is so well trod territory. Jack has written a book about this already. I wonder how much really we're going to get out of it. And I was so pleasantly surprised by the first 3 episodes for 2 reasons. Number one, your narration is fantastic, and it's full of Jack McCallum quips about this and that really spices it up. And number 2, I was surprised, stupidly. I'm obviously stupid for being surprised by this. I was surprised by the power of hearing the voices of those guys talking to you in an unguarded manner. And even if the recording sometimes is not the best sound quality, it all comes through. And just to hear these guys for extended periods of time, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, Michael, Larry, Magic, talking to someone they trust and like and has been with them throughout their careers covering it, I would just sit there and freeze for a moment like, wow, that's Larry Bird's voice is in my ear. It feels weirdly personal. Like Larry's talking to me right now. It's very cool. And I want to congratulate you and I want to urge everyone to listen to it when it comes out.
Well, I appreciate that, Zach. The only reason this could work was that I didn't want to retell the book. In fact, in doing this, there's 8 episodes. I never looked at the book. Honestly, I never reopened the book again. Obviously, I'm familiar with it. But what I did was try to plan the episodes around what audio I had. And like you said, the power of the thing is the audio. Somehow, miraculously, in a world where I do most things haphazardly, I was smart enough to save these tapes. And I had them in a giant red bag, and I probably haven't saved too many other things from the journalism career. There might be something from 35 years ago, and then I lost the tape, that I did 6 days ago. We do stuff on our phone now.
Yeah.
Which makes it different. I'm sure your technological abilities were far above mine. And I did all these on the old-fashioned Radio Shack recorder where you had the little mini cassettes, and I took them out and I put adhesive tape and marked Jordan, what date it was. And that's the only reason it worked. And I do agree that hearing these guys' voices is what makes it work.
I guess this is the power of radio, right? I mean, it's different. It just felt different to me than watching them on television. Maybe on television you have a sense of the wider audience, or you see all the media they're talking to. It feels like you're sitting in on an intimate conversation, which you kind of are, because you travel to all these guys' homes for the most part and interviewed them all for this book. There's audio, I believe. You have audio in there from 1991, 92 too, as well, right? Like real time Dream Team audio.
A little bit, but there are times, and I'm sure you go through this in your business, where had I known back then in 2000, I was collecting these interviews 2009, 2010, 2011. Had I known, hey, 10 years from now, there's this thing called a podcast, and I need really clear audio. There's times when I said to myself, will you shut up? Why did I laugh or something, Clyde Drexler got on this tangent about why he's as good as Michael, Jordan. And in it, I'm in his house, and it was so funny the way he was doing. I'm kind of laughing as he's doing it, even though he's completely serious. And there were times when I, kind of interrupted the guy, and in a perfect world, I would have known back then that I was going to do this. But some of the, as you alluded to, some of the imperfections of it, some of the scratchiness, some of the fact that we were interviewing in a car or walking around Spokane, Washington, in the case of John Stockton, some of that is what kind of gave it the verisimilitude, I hope, at least.
That's the first time anyone has said that word on my podcast, and I'm not entirely sure I knew how to pronounce it, actually, until right now. I'm assuming you pronounced it correctly. By the way, I'm glad.
I hope so. I thought for a second before it came out,
I'm glad that you specified that Clyde was talking about being better than Michael Jordan, because I think, given the differences in their careers, people could have thought, well, what Michael is he talking about? Oh, he was actually talking about being better than Michael Jordan or as good as Michael Jordan. He was that, not self-aware. But so of all these conversations, I have to start with you, Jack McCallum, made in the making of your book what I consider maybe the greatest mistake that a sports journalist has ever made in the reporting process in the history of sports journalism. Do you want to know what it is?
I would love to.
You interviewed Charles Barkley. You went to dinner, I believe, in Phoenix with Charles Barkley. And the interview is over dinner, and it sounds great because you can hear the clinking and some of the background noise. The atmosphere is great. And you leave the restaurant, and you are with Charles, who is not driving because he's just gotten through the DUI stuff and he's trying to cut back. And Charles passes by a bar. You pass by a bar, and Charles says, "Hey, Jack, let's go in and have a drink." And you said no, and you went back to your hotel. Who turns down an after-hours drink with Charles Barkley? What are you doing, Jack?
Well, here's what happened at dinner. Charles, I ordered one drink. I ordered a vodka on the rocks. And so I was drinking it. And during the course of time that Charles starts talking, I said, "Oh, you took a cab over here? What'd you do that for?" He goes, "Hey man, you spend a weekend in jail. It's a long weekend," because he had just had the DUI. And he looks at me and he goes, "You're over the limit right now." And I go, "Really? I was going to have another drink. You're over the limit right now." And all I could think about by the time we got out of the restaurant, I had probably had one more, but I had probably had two. I was driving. I'm taking Charles home. And honestly, there were two reasons that I didn't go in. Number one, I was afraid that I still had to drive myself back, whereas Charles was going to get a ride home. Number two, I was kind of afraid that he didn't really want me to come, that within the bar was kind of a pre-assigned meeting that Charles had had. Let's just leave it at that. I can't be sure, but I just thought maybe this
That makes your decision even worse. All of this does is make the decision worse.
What can I say, man?
If Charles Barkley ever said to me, "Zach, let's go get a drink," I think honestly the only situation that I would demur is if my wife were in the delivery room and Charles had suddenly gotten into the delivery room to ask me to go out for a drink. That's the only time that I would say no. And even then, I would probably ask the doctor, like, how much time do I really have here? Like, what are we talking about?
Well, you're making me rue that decision, man. So let's move on. I feel bad already.
So, The Last Dance, on the last episodes got into the Dream Team a little bit, and I said on my podcast with Mike Greenberg on Monday, Michael Jordan recounts the story of Rod Thorne calling him to ask him to be on the Dream Team. And Michael tells it like this. He said, "I asked Rod, well, who's playing? Who's playing? Who's playing?" And he's indicating, I think he's trying to indicate to the audience that he's asking Rod, well, I just want to make sure that Magic's in, Larry's in, Scotty's in, whatever. And Rod replies to him, well, don't worry, Michael. The guy you're thinking about is not playing. And Michael then says, "Well, I didn't even bring up Isaiah Thomas. I didn't bring him up." And I said on my podcast Monday, boy, that's just too convenient for both Michael and Rod to have that sort of plausible deniability that no one actually said the words Isaiah Thomas. Now, I'm not at home right now. I don't have my basketball library with me, but I also remember thinking, I think Jack's book tells a very different kind of story about that. And lo and behold, I listened to the 3rd episode of the Dream Team tapes, and there is Michael Jordan on tape, not in living color because he's not in living color, but on tape, his voice in my ears saying what to you, Jack McCallum?
He said, when Rod called, I told him I didn't want to play if Isaiah was on the team. Now, a couple things are going on here.
He's on tape. You're not saying that on the tape. Michael says that on tape in his voice. You have him dead to rights.
When I went to that interview, it was one of the things, that I was trying to figure out how to bring up, and Michael brought it up, and there's not a this is off the record type of thing before that. Michael even talked about later, what a lot of people forget was that during the qualifying tournament in Portland, John Stockton got hurt. In fact, he broke his leg. He had what's called a spiral fracture, which turned out to be a broken leg. They were trying to decide, were they going to replace him? Now, they didn't really need to, and then there was a whole other issue, which was it wasn't as well known because, the Dream Team had been selected by then. Who were they going to call? Would Isaiah have gotten that call? And that's a whole other thing. Michael brought up that himself, said he was worried they were going to call Isaiah then. And there's so many factors to this, Zach. I mean, the astounding thing when you think about it was that the coach of the Dream Team was the same guy who had coached the Pistons to 2 championships. They were the defending champions when Chuck Daly was picked for the team. And he did not push to get Isaiah on the team. I know that for a fact. Maybe in a perfect world, he would have, but he didn't. And then he goes over to Barcelona, and who is Michael Jordan's golfing buddy? Who is his confidant? Who is his guy? Chuck and Michael were like one of the hot couples of Barcelona. And I often thought that had to be really tough for Isaiah. And whatever Isaiah and I went through some travails, and I know he considers me one of those, you always loved Jordan and hated the bad boys guys. I know because he told me that. But I feel sorry for him that this whole thing is getting resurrected and that he's just not coming out that good in it. And I really wish sometimes maybe he could just stop talking about it, although it's something that people obviously bring up. It's a sexy topic.
And that moment in the documentary was not the first moment, but certainly the biggest moment where you are reminded, and I was reminded, this is a Michael Jordan production as much as anything else. Michael had a lot of say over what's in this documentary. And there is no follow-up to his declaration that Isaiah Thomas was never brought up in the Rod Thorne phone call. A very simple follow-up would have been, let's bring Jack McCallum on camera, who wrote a book about the Dream Team and has a tape of Michael Jordan saying this. That's not in the documentary. In fact, you, despite being one of the chief chroniclers of this era, are not interviewed in the documentary at all. I don't know why that is. I suspect that it is because of Michael's ongoing Sports Illustrated vendetta dating to the famous baseball cover, or is it something else?
No. That had nothing to do with it. Because, in fact, according to Sam Smith, if there was one guy that Michael might have wanted out of the documentary, it would have been Sam, who wrote the Jordan Rules, the book about it.
One of the absolute seminal sports journalism books. If people haven't read that book, it's obviously been featured in the movie. It's hard to explain when it came out what a giant deal it was among, even I was 13 or 14 when it came out. Even people my age were like, what is this book? We got to read a book. We got to read this book voluntarily. Like high school students were voluntarily going to get a book.
Yeah, I told Sam it ruined my life for 2 weeks, man, because the editor would say to me, hey, did you know all this stuff? And I go, well, I knew a little bit, but I wasn't out in Chicago every day. So we were following Sam's tail for a long time. But anyway, Sam says that the director, Jason Hare, went to Michael and said, hey, do you care if we interview Sam Smith? And Michael says, quote, according to Sam, I don't give an F who you interview. So it didn't have anything to do with that. They had set me up to interview a couple times, one time I was in New York. I wrote about this in my first blog on SI, and they told me that, well, you can't do it today because JT's. We got to do JT, and I go, that's amazing. James Taylor's in this documentary, man. Must be like a going to Carolina in my mind type of thing. But it turned out it was Justin Timberlake, as of course you probably knew. So they just didn't. I had a lot of email exchanges about it. They just didn't get to me. I had my little one paragraph say in Sports Illustrated about it, and maybe it's a rationalization, but I have really enjoyed blogging about this thing and looking at it without feeling I'm a little bit a part of it. That could be part rationalization, but I've really enjoyed kind of working with this wide canvas that the documentary has presented.
That's interesting. That is interesting. It's a shame you're not in it for the perspective you would bring, but you can't argue with getting bumped for Justin Timberlake. I'm sorry. If you're getting bumped for Justin Timberlake, you just have to take the loss on that one.
He's on at least for, I think it's about 13 seconds too.
Whatever was enough to get him in the commercial promoting The Last Dance was enough. And frankly, I wanted more Carmen Electra. I could have done like an hour of Carmen Electra, Rodman's story. They could have been a whole Carmen Electra episode for all I care. I would have listened to the whole thing. And you remember interviewing Michael for the Dream Team book, and you talk a lot in the podcast and about just the challenge of getting all of these guys to sit down for 2 hours because they're the most famous people in sports and the hardest to get. And even just now, I wrote a giant feature for ESPN on Game 7 in 1998 between the Pacers and the Bulls, and I explored every avenue I could to get Larry Bird, who was the coach of the Pacers. I thought I was going to get him. Then I didn't get him. Then I thought I was going to get him again. I had multiple people working multiple angles to get him. I think he considered it, and in the end, we just had to go without him. And it's like these guys they don't want to do interviews. And a lot of them don't do any interviews. But you go to Michael, and in your recounting of it, you're nervous to bring up a couple of topics and shocked that he just sort of volunteers this information, right?
He was just, I caught these guys. It was so lucky. It did take a while to get Michael. The Larry Bird story, how I got him, is sort of unbelievable. He's the last guy I got. Magic, it took a while. A couple people it didn't. But I was just so lucky to hit them at the right time. It was, at that point, 18 years, almost 20 years after they did this. They had all accomplished other things. None of them really had a bone to pick. They had been successes, and they really looked upon this time in their life as like really great. It wasn't just because I happened to be doing a book on the Dream Team. It was the highlight of most of their lives. Not quite for Michael, but I just hit it really. It hit a lot of chords for them. It was the right time to do it. And that was kind of just, a grace of timing that I happened to kind of plug into that. And
you say very, very, you have this moment in the podcast where you say, as soon as Michael starts opening up and being honest, right then, that's it. I've got a book. Like if I've got Michael saying this stuff, I've got something.
Yeah, the first person I talked to was Scottie Pippen, and it was unusual. It was just kind of coincidentally, and I remember saying to Scottie, how little I kind of knew him, even though I was in his presence, for 100 stories, and every time I'd go to Chicago, I'd end up doing a Michael story, and sort of the story of Scottie's career was kind of being overshadowed by Michael. And sure enough, during the interview, that's what we ended up talking about. And Scottie said, hey, Scottie's, does anybody have a deeper voice than that guy, by the way?
I love Scottie's voice.
Barry White on the, well, that's okay. I knew that's what we'd talk about, but that's okay. And I'll tell you, Zach, he told me an anecdote the first 20 minutes. I will just never forget this. There's like 10 quotes that stand out for me from doing those interviews. And one of Scottie's was, the referees used to ask me if I could get a pair of Michael's shoes. They weren't asking for Joe Dumars' shoes. In his own way, I mean, how much would the bad boys have killed for that quote, during...
Oh, that's right. Yeah, absolutely.
They weren't asking for Joe Dumars' shoes.
It's funny. one of the things that's happened with The Last Dance coming out is, and I talked about this with Michael Wilbon as well, there's among media who were there covering that team at the time, there is this weird Pippen regret that a lot of them feel of not appreciating Scottie as much as they should have at the time. Wilbon even wrote, we talked about it, he wrote a scathing column about players in the wake of the infamous sitting out the last play when Kukoc hits the shot, calling Scottie a punk, and Scottie being known around the league as a punk, and he regrets some of that coverage, and just sort of generally regrets like not appreciating Scottie. And it's unavoidable because if you play with Michael Jordan, that's going to be the biggest story. But it is interesting that there's a media regret that's being felt now as this team is back into our lives. And in talking, I'm actually thinking about writing about this, in talking to the Bulls players on that team about things that had almost nothing to do with Scottie, about Tony Kukoc, which obviously has something to do with Scottie, about Game 7 against the Pacers, which Scottie was a critical part of, so I guess these do have to do with him. In just random asides, unprompted, all of these players would start talking about how much they love Scottie. Love is the word they use. Not like, not great teammate, not fun guy to be around. I love Scottie. I love Scottie. We all love Scottie. It's almost like they talk about him like some people talk about the 10th man everybody loves, the teammate that's just wonderful to have around, except they're using that sort of mood and terminology about an absolute superstar who at his peak was a top 5 player in the NBA. And I'm actually exploring it a little bit. I'm not sure I'm going to write something, but I mean, love is not a word that gets thrown around that much in sports about interpersonal relationships between alpha men. These guys just went out of their way unprompted to talk about how much they love Scottie and why. And I think that plus the sort of media regret that you see coming out about not appreciating him. We're going to get to the Kukoc play, I think, in the coming episodes, and I'm not sure how Scottie's going to come off with that. But to me, so far, he's been kind of one of the big winners of this documentary.
Yeah, no question. Scottie put his arm around you. Michael punched you in the face. I mean, that's kind of what happened. And you know what's odd, Zach, is that Scottie, in terms as a basketball player, on the biggest stage of the world when Jordan was clearly the show, and we're talking about the Dream Team in Barcelona, that's when basketball-wise, people just stood up. Because when you got those 12 guys together, we can take Christian Laettner out of it. When you got those 11 guys together, it was clear that the best basketball players, now Larry and Magic were at the end of their career, so the 3 best basketball players in Barcelona were Michael Jordan, Charles Barkley, and Scottie Pippen. And that really, Chuck Daly even said something like, I can't remember whether I have it on the podcast or not, but Chuck used to say before the game to Krzyzewski or PJ Carlesimo, well, I don't know who's going to start. Give me Michael and Scottie. Give me Michael and Scottie. Then give me, Ewing or David or whoever you want. And Larry Bird told me something really interesting, that I asked all these guys what they took away from it basketball-wise, and Bird went into this thing about, man, I just used to sit there when I was on the bench and watch Scottie and Michael play defense. Michael would edge the guy towards Scottie, and then Scottie would come toward him, and by the time the 2 of them were around him, the guy would just, throw the ball up in the air. And this is Larry Bird, one of the great fundamental practitioners of basketball, talking about the one thing that he drew out of this. And Pippen's greatness as a defensive player and a versatile offensive player was really on display during the Olympics, and that's when everybody, I think, started to really appreciate him.
Barkley obviously is the author of 2 of the greatest Dream Team quotes ever, one of which you recount in the podcast about Chuck Daly saying, if you can coach those, you can coach anybody, referring to the Bad Boys, about Chuck's qualifications to coach a Dream Team. And the other one, of course, is, I don't know much about Angola, but they're in trouble. That's an all-timer.
In trouble.
I don't know much about Angola, but Angola's in trouble.
For years, I thought it was, I don't know nothing about Angola, but he said, I don't know anything about Angola, but Angola's in trouble. And it was just something about that. Wilbon told me that he used to just once in a while call up Charles and go, I don't know anything about Angola, and then hang up the phone. There's just something about it that's so funny. And it's also humorous that Charles clings to this idea that he had to elbow Hector Coimbra, the terrifying Angolan forward during the first game of the Dream Team. And that was really a big deal if you were over there, because people were looking for reasons to snipe at the Dream Team and, hey, this is a mismatch. What are we doing here? They went on a 46-1 run during that game, And Charles at dinner that night still clinging to the idea that, Hector Coimbra was elbowing him during the game and he had to take care of business, which is
had to set the tone. Had to set the tone against Angola.
Set the tone during the 46-1 run. We had to make sure they knew who was boss.
Well, one of the things on the podcast that I had forgotten, I assume it's in your book again, which I don't have, is that although Barkley was immediately volunteering himself for the team, in your telling, he was not a lock to make the team. And in fact, you have audio from David Stern saying essentially Charles is a loose cannon. He's crossed the line a lot of times. So in your telling, although Charles becomes, as you said, arguably the number two, I mean, Jordan is Jordan, but Charles for a lot of those games was the best player or the leading scorer anyway.
Charles was the MVP probably was the MVP in Barcelona. Yeah.
But in your telling, there was some hesitancy to even put him on the team because he's going to be representing the U.S. in a very high-profile moment, and we don't exactly know if he's going to do something impolitic, let's say.
Well, in the winter of '91 at the All-Star game, there wasn't much talk about the Dream Team, and I say on the podcast that has something to do with, there's just no social media, there was no website, there was no Twitter. I mean, I would have been tweeting about this every single day. And I decided to do this story where we would put 5 guys that I would, not arbitrarily, but I would pick as starting guys if they were going to go to Barcelona, because it still wasn't completely confirmed who was going. I picked Magic, Michael, Barkley, Ewing, and Karl Malone, because Larry Bird had it indicate at that point he wasn't going to play. Charles got the idea that this was some sort of mandated, that the NBA had decided, hey, these are my first 5 picks. It was totally, couldn't have been further from the truth. It was Jack McCallum's 5 picks. And in point of fact, when it came down to who they were getting, Chuck Daly had a magic list. Nobody, as far as I know, ever saw it. The late, great Matt Dobeck, who was the Pistons public relations man, may have seen it. And it's been tried to reconstruct it, who Chuck really wanted. And as far as I can tell, he really wanted Michael. He wanted Magic for the leadership. He wanted Pippen for the versatility and defense. He wanted David Robinson. He loved his athleticism and ability to run the floor. And he wanted Chris Mullin, because we always wanted jump shooters. There was always the fear they were going to zone you. You'd hit 25% of your jump shots and you'd end up being down 6 with 3 minutes to go and maybe lose the game. So Charles, nobody kind of knew. They all wanted him for his talent, and it took some convincing. And I really think Rod Thorne, who we mentioned before, who was a basketball guy, one of the things Stern said to me, the basketball guys can never have enough basketball people. The people like me, who are in charge of sort of the diplomacy of the thing, we worry about loose cannons. And it was final that Charles' basketball ability put him on, and the elbow notwithstanding, he was by far the most valuable Olympian, not just by playing, but in terms of diplomacy, getting out and seeing people, reinforcing the idea that the Dream Team was really a bunch of good guys who just weren't clubbing people by 60 points.
Well, some of your best stories in the book are about trying to follow Barkley around Barcelona on off nights and trail and being always like one bar behind him. And somehow you would get information from the bar that he was at. He would leave a note or tell the bartender, hey, this guy's going to walk in, tell him I'm at this bar now. Just going bar to bar to bar to try and find Barkley, as he's the Pied Piper of basketball in Barcelona. that's a life experience, frankly, I don't think a lot of reporters now will ever get. No one's going to be going bar to bar to bar, trailing LeBron James or Luka Doncic or something like that. It's just, that's not the way life works anymore.
David Dupree, the great USA Today writer, he had an assignment that, I don't know whether it was every day, it could have been every day or every other day, that Charles was, quote, writing for USA Today. But, he was going to write his journal. And David was not a night owl at all. And he just could never find Charles to try to nail down what they were writing, for the next day. One night told me, if you see Charles, could you ask him to give me a call? This was pre-cell phone. You try to chase people down back then. I mean, it is extraordinary the way we operate now. It's extraordinary that anything got done. And part of the reason the book was pretty successful was that there wasn't a lot of in-between news. There wasn't everyday tweets. There was the newspaper guys could write every day, but there wasn't a constant barrage of information about the Dream Team. And boy, that turned out to be really fortunate for me. It wasn't a story that was unbelievably widely told the specifics, even though the general parameters of it obviously are incredibly well known.
Talking about Larry watching scrimmages or watching games from the bench and marveling at Jordan and Pippen's defense, one of the things in the Dream Team Tapes podcast that stuck out to me was Leitner's description of what playing with those guys was like in practice. And obviously the last episodes of The Last Dance featured the famous Monte Carlo scrimmage, which is supposedly the greatest basketball game ever played that nobody saw, and now you've seen tape of it. And I think that the documentary may have gotten a couple of little details about that scrimmage not completely right, but Leitner's description of it, of playing with those guys, is so beautiful. And I'll let you describe it. What is to me, it was really beautiful. What does he say?
Yeah, and John Stockton says something that echoes it. Leitner says something like, it was like when you were back playing with your dad at the your dads at the YMCA, and you make a move, and they know exactly what you're going to do, and the pass is like right there. And he's coming from a pretty good brand of basketball. I mean, they were playing pretty good at Duke, and he said the level of it, the level of speed, transition from defense to offense, and the idea of getting the ball when you're open, he said it was unlike anything he ever saw. And the least poetic, or the most prosaic guy I know, one of them, John Stockton, was talking about that too. And Stock went into this 10 seconds that left me dumbfounded. He goes, it was just like basketball poetry. And for John to say something like that, he was reaching deep. He was reaching deep into his soul to come up with that. And for all the levels these guys had, championships, MVP awards, MVP of the finals awards, that was at root what they really got out of this. They had this experience of playing with guys at last that were kind of, sort of all equal. And all of them, to one degree or another, mentioned that particular aspect, which I guess isn't surprising, but when you're as accomplished as those guys, hearing them say it was very interesting to me.
Well, if you think of who on that team is known primarily as a passer, or passing is like one of the first two or three things you would say about their games. Obviously Magic. I think Bird probably would get into that conversation. He was a genius passer, and Stockton. And if you would think that, and Bird doesn't even play the Monte Carlo scrimmage, from what I recall.
No, Bird plays.
Oh, he did play a little bit. Okay.
The two that are left out are Drexler and Stockton. Stockton was still injured.
Stockton didn't play. That's right.
Yeah, and Drexler Bird was kind of forced to play because he tells me, I think it's on the podcast, he says something like, "Oh man, I got to play today," and he looks like he's 100 years old, but yet at a key part of the scrimmage, he makes a steal. If you can picture it in your mind's eye, he's dribbling down in this painful way, and he makes one of these operatic fakes that he used to do, the big fake, that he could really sell, and somebody bites. I can't remember who. And Bird goes in for a layup, and Jordan yells, "I knew you still had it in you, Larry. That's the way to go. I knew you still had it in you." It is like such a great moment. And later I showed the tape to Mullen, and we're at his house, and Chris Mullen goes, "Hey, Liz, come here a minute, man. Watch Larry steal." And he calls his wife in to watch this play. And it sort of spoke a lot about this team's, I think I even referred to it as reverence toward Bird. And part of it has to do with him being old. This is it. He retires right after Barcelona. He comes back and retires. And part of it had to do with that, but part of it was this kind of quiet Larry legend thing that was going on. And it's very prominent sort of motif through the whole Dream Team experience, I would say.
Yeah, and Leitner, so you have end of career Larry, Magic's playing, Stockton sitting out. You just wouldn't think the first thing Leitner would talk about is the passing. You would think it would be the athleticism or the dunking or the tenacity. And he gives you this beautiful description of he makes a cut, and in his head he's like, "Oh, I've made the right cut. I'm open." And before just as he's realizing that he's open, the ball is hitting his hands, and the sensation of just, I thought I was really smart and thinking ahead of the game, and these guys are like, the ball's already here before I even fully digested it. It's a very beautiful description. And you do talk about the deification of Bird. That's the language you use. And you talk, I don't remember this being in your book. You talk about Larry's back being so bad at times that when he would go on drives, every mile, after 1 mile of driving, he would have to get out of his car to stretch his back and then get back in the car and do it again. So if he's driving 10 miles, he's got to get out 9 or 10 times.
His back was almost kept him from, when he was first asked about the Barcelona, I think his answer was pretty much 99% no. I think one of the things he says to me that's on the podcast is, I didn't want to take that spot away from somebody if I'm going to go over there and I can't play. But then his back, he just sort of never knew with it. He had this guy, a physiotherapist named Dan Dyrek. I had a bad back at the time, so I even mentioned, I went to see Dyrek a couple times. One of these miracle men, Zach, you've been around. A lot of these guys have their guys. Steve Nash had a guy, I think his name Rick Celebrini. He was this guy, he was magic fingers, and that was Larry's guy. And he finally realized it was good enough. And the fact that he went and was able to contribute at least, I'd say 60% of the time, was a really major factor in the Dream Team success.
While we're on the subject of Larry, just please tell the people, even if some people know this story, maybe I knew it and I'd forgotten it, how you finally convinced Larry Bird to sit down with you and talk about the Dream Team as the last interview. What not even a ploy, what you had to resort to finally guilt Larry into sitting with you.
Well, as you alluded to earlier, I couldn't, appointments kept getting, and I couldn't quite figure it out because Larry and I had a good relationship, not as close as him and, Jackie McMullen can get him with a clip of the phone, but not anybody else really can, maybe Bob Ryan. But we had always had a good relationship. But Larry his sort of de facto position is he'd rather not talk than talk. That's kind of his de facto position.
I just lived it very heartbreakingly. I just lived it.
And we just kept missing. And the book was done. It was in what they call, as you know, but it's called galleys when you're sort of, supposed to be done. They don't want to, they've already paid money to print the galleys, so the publishing company doesn't want to start printing thousands of dollars to undo it. I hadn't gotten Larry face to face, even though he was peppered throughout the book. And I called up his secretary who had heard from me about 6 times by now, and I said, tell Larry that I am going in for a prostate cancer surgery to remove my prostate next week. And if I die on the table, my last thought is going to be that Larry Bird blew me off for this book. It happened to be true.
Yeah, it wasn't fake. You weren't making it up.
No, it was a Friday afternoon, and my surgery was scheduled for not the next Monday, but the following Monday or Tuesday. And Larry gets on the phone. All right, man, what do you want? I go, no, I got to talk to you in person. you know how it is, Zach. You can't, I mean, we're doing this and it's working out fine, but if you're trying to nail down a pro athlete, it's too easy for them to leave you or leave something unsaid unless you're sitting in front of them. And I said, I'm coming out to Indianapolis. Please try to see me. You know, I flew out on Sunday night, talked to him on Monday, and he was great. And I sort of, partly because of the galley situation, I ended up making him the last chapter of the book. And whether or not it was part rationalization, but the things he had to say, you know, spoke to a lot of the essence of sports and things like that. And I'm so glad my biggest relief, you know, and my biggest pride in the book was getting all those guys to sit still and really, really concentrate on the subject at hand for a very decent amount of time. And as you know, that's one of the keys to our business, right? Getting them to sit down, concentrate on what you're saying, and really think about it for an hour or 2 hours. It's really valuable.
So he says something to you that I don't remember being in the book, or whatever, but he says something to you that I don't want you to spoil the last 5 episodes of your podcast that I haven't listened to yet because I don't have them. Larry says if the Dream Team had gone on for 2 more weeks, we might have had problems. Can you hint at what he was maybe talking about without spoiling anything in the podcast?
I tried to get him to elucidate. Well, what he said was, to reiterate what you said was, you know, and he had the same romantic notions of everybody else. He loved it. He loved it. It's one of the greatest things of his life. But he said his quote was something like, "Zach, well, I always say if that team would be together 2 weeks, another 2 weeks, things would have broken apart a little bit," or something like that. Meaning, and he wouldn't tell me who, guys were already starting to go talk about playing time. Guys were already starting to nip a little bit. There were little tensions during it. So to answer your question, I couldn't get him to go any further, but there were little tensions during the thing. Probably the biggest one between Karl Malone and Magic. You know, Karl's style, the greatest game nobody ever saw, the trash talking between Magic and Michael, that whole thing was not Karl Malone. And Magic's leadership, kind of being the outgoing, it's my team guy, that was not Karl's thing either. And among the little tensions on that team that never came out in Barcelona, never showed itself, but did when they came back to the United States, was between Karl and Magic. Because if you remember when they got back, Karl suddenly, in a story with Harvey Aronson in the New York Times, brings up the specter of playing against somebody with HIV.
That's what I was going to say. I couldn't remember the timing, the timing if it was before or after the Dream Team, but I know and remember that Karl was the most high-profile player to say, I'm not sure I'm comfortable playing against Magic Johnson.
After being his teammate for, since June, June, July, August, for 3 months. They weren't together for 3 months. Then he came back, and I think Harvey went over to this preseason game. Karl was at Madison Square Garden, and he just starts kind of talking about it, and it sort of renewed the talk about it, which had been strangely dormant throughout the weeks and weeks of the qualifying tournament and the Olympics. And it was a very strange, in fact, episode 8 of the podcast is kind of about the aftermath, that all the things that went, that happened with Magic. Larry came back and be retired. Never mind what we're finding out what happened to Michael.
Well, let's talk about some Last Dance stuff because you were there. So let's talk about Jack was there. Question 1. A lot of you talk about in the podcast about how Isaiah Thomas kind of made his own bed a little bit with some of these guys disliking him, and you can go back to the alleged freeze out at the All-Star game in 1985, which I think is kind of half bogus at least. The walk off in 91 where the Pistons leave the floor early. And in between those is the infamous media scrum after Game 5 of the 1987 Eastern Conference Finals, which the Celtics win on the steal by Bird underneath the DJ lays it in.
That's pretty good.
Where Isaiah agrees with Rodman that, and Isaiah's quote is something like, if Larry's an exceptional talent, but if Larry were black, he would be just another guy. I believe you were in that media scrum with a recorder held to his face, or you were at least at the game. When he said that, was there an immediate like chill going up and down your body of, this is the thing now?
Oh, exactly. I mean, those kind of explosive quotes that you get at a player's worst moment, like Twitter wasn't, just imagine had there been Twitter then. I mean, 100 million people would have tweeted that. And I can't even remember if I put it in my story. I just can't remember. But it kind of grew. And what happened was to answer your question, it just seems so small.
Wow.
Because
like petty, you mean?
Yeah, petty is the word I'm looking for. Because Dennis at that point was like, this is 87. Dennis is like in his second year, or was he in his rookie year? He may have been a rookie. And it was just something like a rookie says that's dumb.
Right.
That you say after you lose. Isaiah's a smart guy. He had been in the league. He had made his bones. He was an all-star. He understood what he was in the league, and he understood what Larry Bird was in the league. Isaiah Thomas doesn't think for 1 second, believe that. But yet here he was after throwing the pass that Larry stole, reiterating something that Dennis Rodman...
Who was a rookie, by the way, you're correct. He was a rookie.
That Dennis Rodman said. And I did say later, and I can't remember whether I say this in the podcast, but I know I've written it somewhere, that had this been the age of Twitter, what Isaiah was really reacting to was this overgeneralization of white players being smart and black players, and when a guy's a Caucasian player, he automatically gets more attention, which is a thing. It's a thing. He just happened to pick the wrong person to say it about at the wrong time. And then if he ever wanted to live it down, he felt so bad about it that I think it was partly Isaiah that engineered this extremely awkward press conference the following week at the finals. When Larry shows up, Isaiah's dressed like he looks great, man. And Larry comes in his short shorts. He looks like he has never looked more like Big Bird on an episode.
He's wearing a trucker hat or something at the press conference.
That's right.
Too.
He's got a hat on. It looks like sort of a country music MTV video somehow, And Larry's very awkward at it at the press conference, and Isaiah, doesn't exactly know what to say. And
you're there, right? You were there.
Oh yeah, it was a massive.
You must have been like, this might be the strangest press conference I cover, no matter how long I stay in this business, right?
And I've covered some strange ones, and this thing was really awkward. That none of them exactly got the message through, that they wanted to get. But once again, it was those one of those moments where you could say Isaiah made his own bed, but he tried to unmake it and he tried to make it better. And he wasn't completely successful at it, frankly.
The most recent episode of the documentary got into Michael's gambling issues. It unearthed all the shady characters to whom he owed money, including the big check to Slim Bowler. All of this is surfacing after the Atlantic City trip in the 1993 conference finals against the Knicks. You're there. You're covering that series. You're covering all of the unfolding gambling allegations. And I said this to Mike Greenberg on Monday. I was 15 at that time. Huge basketball fan. Just a complete nut for basketball. Watched every game. Just diehard fan. I don't remember the gambling thing penetrating the conversation that 15-year-olds were having about the NBA. I mean, I was obsessed with that series. I hated the Knicks. I had money on the Bulls. I was obsessed with the basketball. I just don't remember us sitting around the lunch table talking about Michael Jordan's gambling, even though it must have been on SportsCenter every single night. It didn't penetrate our world somehow, but it penetrated your world. And I wonder what you remember as all of this stuff is coming out at a very high profile basketball time. I wonder what you remember, just sort of what it felt like to cover that. If you felt suddenly you were no longer even covering a basketball story, if you were covering a story of, boy, this could end badly for a human being, or is this ever going to be this? Is this going to change everything about Michael Jordan? I don't know what you recall about the spring of '93 as all of this is coming out.
Well, I remember very specifically, and once again, I must resort to the pre-social media age. Had I been compelled to write every day and tweet every day, something in that week I would have said something more about the gambling or said something stupid. Now, the New York papers every day were writing about it. But so far as Slim Buller went, here's what I wrote on SI.com last week. Stern was definitely too easy about the Slim Buller.
Yeah, you said Stern. You flat out wrote this week. Stern gave Michael a pass.
He lied about can you imagine doing this now? He lied about what this check was for, not to mention the personal indiscretion of hanging around with these characters and owing them huge sums of money. Richard Esquinas, supposedly, he owed $1 million for golfing debts. So he blew it on not punishing him more than that. The Atlantic City gambling trip, Zach, I never quite got what that was about. Simply why it was a big deal. It was never a big deal to you. One of the real subplots, and I talk about it in the podcast and probably in the book also, was Jordan's ridiculous energy level. His nonstop caffeinated way, the way he lived his life. Every single person I interviewed, every one of the players talked about Jordan. They'd play the game. It wasn't over till 1 o'clock. They'd come back and play cards till 5 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning. Jordan would take a shower, go out and play 36 holes, come back and dust Germany's, in the next game. Every single person, this is how he lived his life. And I'm from Atlantic City, and my father lived down there. And when the gambling trip came out, I remember they showed Bally's, where Michael was gambling. My dad was there that night playing blackjack.
Wow.
So, he didn't see Michael or anything. My dad went and either won or lost $60 every time he went. So, to me, it wasn't like a big deal. What happened was he did it between games 1 and 2, and then he lost game 2. So, to cut to your question, by the time we get to the finals and Phoenix, I distinctly remember talking to my editors and saying, look, Jordan, the way he's played basketball in the last 4 weeks, it's like nobody's played a sport like this. He comes back 0-2, dusts the Knicks, gets 54 in game 4, drags the Bulls to the finish line over the Suns, even though it's Paxson who hits the final shot. What do I write? What kind of story do I write? Do I write Esquinas and Slim Buller, or can I write that we haven't seen basketball sport played like this? Because I wasn't writing in between all the weeks. I wasn't writing on SI.com, which didn't exist. So I wrote kind of a basketball story. So if you would look at my stuff during that time, it probably is not Buller and Esquinas heavy, even though it was alluded to. And part of that has to do with the times, and part of it was, at least regarding the Atlantic City trip, I thought it was overblown, personally.
Well, you wrote on SI last week, the exact quote is something like, your view of Jordan's gambling then and now is that he was just short of a gambling problem, but only because of how much money he had. Basically, that's the way you kind of summed it up.
Unless he was a degenerate gambler, whatever that phrase means, there's no way Michael could have lost all his money, But he had, what I said was, he obviously had an adrenaline problem. And he says to the director, Jason Hare told me, that Jordan says, I don't think he says it on camera. I think Jason told me he says it off camera, that his only regret was hanging around with some of the people he hung around with. That if somebody would wave, here's a guy willing to go on a, $5,000 Nassau, on the golf course. Okay, man, I'm in. And whether or not that had to do with Jordan chasing away, the kind of milk and cookies image that he had early in his career, I don't know. But he did tell the director that's one of his regrets. Speaking of which,
I think Michael, before the release of the documentary, coming out and saying, in a rare public statement, saying, I think some people are going to come away from this documentary not liking me as much. I think that was an ingenious bit of marketing by Michael, because it primed audiences to expect salacious behind the scenes stuff, where what really is the case is everybody who cares already knows that Michael gambled a lot, already knows that he punched Will Perdue and he punched Steve Kerr and he was very hard on his teammates. And that has all been melded into the image of, this is how you get Michael Jordan. This is how you get the greatest basketball player and the greatest winner in the history of the sport, because he is like this, because he is more competitive than anyone else can relate to. It's all the gambling, the harshness to his teammates, all of this stuff that Michael sort of primed the audience to say, oh, you're not going to like this. It's already been all blended together in the image of what he is, and it's an image that I think people like. So I think him coming out and saying that was a really smart bit of marketing and nothing more, because I think everybody, it's all part of Michael, and it's all part of, when people say Michael's a killer and these modern players aren't killers like Michael is, this is the kind of stuff they're talking about.
Part of, and I've seen 7 and 8, as have some of the other people who have to kind of write, 3,000 words on deadline about this. In episode 7, that's more than ever, but it's kind of like, I'm writing the blog now, but it's kind of like leavened with sort of regret and tears. And there's one point at the end of episode 7, which to me is one of the most amazing things in the documentary. Michael is talking about his intensity, and he says something like, well, if you didn't want to be as intense as me, if you didn't want to do this and get dragged along with me, I got no use for you. And he gets so wrapped up in what he says, his own intensity, that he kind of breaks down.
Wow.
And he says, the last thing in episode 7, it's a great cut. I mean, the directors must live for this. I've never been a director, but there's moments in a story when you know how to end it. And it just ends with Michael sitting there going, break. All right, break. Like all right, that's enough of this. I'm too emotionally tied up to it.
Wow.
And it's really very powerful, and as are both of the episodes, because they're a lot about, as we would expect, the eventful time with his retirement and the murder of his father. But I certainly don't want to give anything away.
A couple more quick ones, and I'll let you go. When Drexler is telling you all this stuff about how the only thing Michael can do better than me on a basketball court is shoot more, are you just looking at him like, dude, are you kidding? You really want to, because you have these moments with people when you want to say to them, I'm not sure you actually want to say that publicly, because it's going to look so stupid. What is your reaction when he says this to you? Because Drexler, Michael leading up to the 92 finals was a thing in the public consciousness. And if you watch the games in the pregame shows, they're talking about how this is Clyde Drexler's moment to make his claim as the greatest player in the world. And Michael, of course, just eviscerates him and eats him for lunch every single game. But when Clyde is saying this to you, what is it? I wish there was a camera on your face as he was saying this to you.
I'll tell you exactly what it was, because I remember it, and it's one of those very journalism-y moments. I'm in Clyde's house. He invites me to his house. I had always gotten along with him. He makes me chicken salad. We're eating a chicken salad sandwich.
Sure.
I'm admiring his art that's around. Both of our fathers had been butchers, and we talk about that. It's a very friendly time. And Clyde is really opening up and talking about this whole thing. And then he starts on this tangent almost, Almost like humorously, like it's a bit. Like it's a bit. And you know what? I go back because of what happened in a moment, and I'll tell you in a moment. It's almost like he said it before. It turns out he did. But he's serious. This is what he thinks. And I just remember sort of thinking, wow, I'm going to have to call him on this. But I feel bad because we're having this friendly moment. But I'm going to have to call him on it. I remember that like very specifically. And I always go into this. Rod Thorne had one of the great funny quotes of all time. Because Steve Snapper Jones, who was a Portland broadcaster, used to have, he was a great guy. I don't know whether you remember Snapper.
Of course I remember Snapper.
Snapper was great. Snapper used to buy into that theory that Clyde was every bit the same player that Michael was. And Rod said to him one time in his West Virginia drawl, Steve, y'all got TVs out there in Portland? That always,
look.
Y'all got TVs out there? So later, when it came out in the book, Clyde, denied. I still remember I was riding around with my grandson, newly born grandson, was in the back car seat. And I get a call on my cell phone. It comes up Clyde Drexler. I go, oh no, and Clyde denied that he said it. And I said, and it just went on. I said, Clyde, I have the tapes. Maybe it was a moment that you regret saying it, but I think you believe it, and I'm going to call you on it, and I'm sorry. I got the tape. Let's go to the videotape.
Let's go to the videotape.
Let's go to the videotape. So,
what did he say? Did once you played it for him, did he own it, or did he try to say, I was just sort of speaking flippantly, or what?
No. Kept saying he didn't say it. Subsequently went on a couple other shows and talked about it. And fortunately, it didn't become a huge thing. I didn't make it a huge thing. I was uncomfortable about it. I felt I don't like. You wrote this just to get controversy. I know people don't believe that, and once in a while, you got to go to the red meat. But this wasn't one of my most pleasant moments because I liked Clyde a lot, and I think he sort of suffered too much by this incessant Jordan comparison. Or as Jordan tells me himself, Clyde, he was the poor man's Michael Jordan.
That's what he says. You got it on tape again. Honestly, I've been rewatching a lot of the 1992 finals for a number of reasons. And Drexler is a really I would read a longer character study on Drexler and his career because he was a really great player. And if you look at his numbers, I mean, there are seasons he's averaging 6, 7, even 8 assists a game. Like, he was a better playmaker than people give him credit for. And he had, other than shooting, he was 3 of 20 from 3 in the 92 finals. And Drexler was like ahead of his time shooting 3. So it was a big deal that he couldn't make any in the finals. Other than that, which is kind of like saying, other than blah, 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 how did you enjoy the play, Mrs. Lincoln? Right. But other than that, Clyde was actually okay in that finals on offense. Defensively, Jordan just destroyed him. He looked like a mummy trying to guard Jordan. And Jordan, and I feel like that series forever changed the way that people thought about Clyde Drexler and changed his place in history. I would really like to go back and study his career more closely because when I was looking at his numbers, his passing in particularly caught me off guard about how many assists he would get every game. He's a really interesting guy. Anyway, I don't want to spoil any more of the Dream Team tapes. It's 8 episodes. I've listened to the first 3. What else do we need to know about how to find the podcast, how it came about? What else do we need to know?
Well, I was just lucky, podcast was an art form that I was sort of, we were all unaware of it. And I remember you came into my class. I was teaching a college class, and you told me something like, if you're doing a podcast, you got to make it your own. You got to sell yourself on it. And I was very skeptical. I knew I had the voices of these guys, and that was the power of it. So I was really happy when I, wrote these things, and a couple sponsors, iHeartRadio and Braun Razors, came along and said, "Hey, we like it too." And that was a new deal for me, trying to sell yourself, kind of, it was a new thing. And I'm really happy that it happened. And I'm glad that you think it's the kind of the power of the voices of the players that bring it together, because, with a lot of this journalism business, Zach, is timing. A lot of journalists got famous because they were there when Kennedy was assassinated. And I just happened to be along for this ride of this golden age of basketball. And honestly, I couldn't, be more fortunate, this accident timing of being able to tell the story of these guys, which somehow, against all odds, endures, that we're still talking about them 30 years later, which suggests that this era of basketball, the 80s, the 90s Dream Team, now we're 10 hours of Michael Jordan doc, there was something very much of an anomaly about that era, something that really sticks around. And so I was glad I got to be plugged into it.
Well, I can't recommend the podcast series, what I've heard of it, highly enough. I mean, we didn't, I didn't want to get too much into it, but there's great stuff in there about Chuck Daly. I love the way, don't spoil it, but I love the way Chuck Daly would give out his cell phone number. That's one of the highlights of the first 3 episodes. You recount the story of the famous Sports Illustrated cover shoot with Michael, Michael, Magic, Barkley, Ewing, Malone, and them holding the Olympic rings and all that. I didn't know the backstory of how that photo shoot came to be and how it almost ended in disaster and who else was in the room with you guys when the photo shoot was taking place. It's a delightful story, and the podcast is full of that stuff. And Jack, you're one of the preeminent storytellers in sports writing, period. It's always an honor to have you on. And again, it's called the Dream Team Tapes. It's coming out soon. Everyone should listen to it. Jack McCallum, one of these times we're actually going to talk about Action Park. It's going to happen at some point. We just never get to it, and we're going to do it properly. But in the meantime, thank you as always for coming on.
Zach, it was a pleasure.